We live inside the earthquake machine. You are here. This is Northridge right here, and it's surrounded by all these red lines and these arrows. What exactly does this mean to be living where we are? Well, one of the implications is that earthquakes happen over and over and over again right here where we live. So here's a picture from 1971. If you were traveling down I-5, where you hit the 210 interchange, you might have discovered a broken overpass. Fast forward a few years, and here, driving down that same freeway, just about a half mile away, when you hit CA-14, you would have noticed a broken overpass again, a different one caused by a different earthquake. So we're having these earthquakes happening over and over again, and it makes you wonder, why do earthquakes always seem to strike in the same place over and over again? And that's what we're going to investigate today. And to do that, let's investigate another earthquake in California. Here we are in beautiful San Francisco. It's April 1906, and the sun is out. But wait, what's that? Do you feel it? It's an earthquake! So the shaking was so hard that this statue was knocked right off its pedestal headfirst into the ground, which is kind of emblematic for how things were in the San Francisco area that day. And in fact, here we are looking downtown San Francisco. This is one of the first skyscrapers on the West Coast, the Call Building, and built in the 1880s, and it started to be on fire. In fact, the fire started getting worse. Everything seemed to be on fire. Here we are at the ferry building along the port along San Francisco Bay, and smoke is everywhere. Entire houses and buildings seemed to fall over and also be lit on fire, and streets were just in chaos. So San Francisco was having a lot of problems. And in fact, you could see that it wasn't everywhere in San Francisco. A lot of the buildings remained perfectly intact, but there were some areas that were very strongly damaged and completely stripped of all of their bricks. And so we're going to have to look at later in the course at why in the world there's this big difference between different parts of the city. But we do know that here in the city of San Francisco, there was intense damage. Well, it took a little while, but damage reports started rolling in from other parts of the city. Of course, they didn't have cell phones at the time in other parts of the state. So here we are about 20, 30 miles south, and here's Moss Beach, where all of a sudden there are these big rails that are bent out of place. Move up to the north, and City Hall in Santa Rosa was completely destroyed. Further north, apartment living in Healdsburg got slightly less fun as the entire front of the building got peeled off. And you waited a little bit longer, and you got news from even further to the north, up here in the Mendocino area. This is a railroad trestle. Now, this used to be a structure strong enough to hold an entire steam locomotive and a huge train filled with cargo, probably big trees and things like that being brought south to help construct the new city of San Francisco. And now it looks like a pile of toothpicks. So huge damage. And when you look at all of these things along that California map, you start seeing a pattern in the damage. Now, all these points here, it seems like you can almost connect them with a straight line. And you know, there were people that lived in other parts of the state. Sacramento has been our state capital since 1852, just 2 years after we became a state, and this is 1906. So there are a lot of people that live in Sacramento. There are people that live inland all over the place in farms, and they did not see the same kind of damage that these people did here along the coast. And so people started going out to those spots and looking. This is Alice Eastwood. She's a famous geologist from the time, actually a famous natural scientist and biologist. But because of this earthquake and her investigations here, she became a little bit more famous in the world of geology. And she's looking at the Earth, and she says, gosh, it seemed to move along this straight line. Well, didn't we say something about a straight line a moment ago? Here we are, connecting all of these points with a straight line. This is a composite of what the damage intensity looked like, reconstructed from newspaper accounts and things like that. And the red zones show the areas with the strongest shaking. And you can see they felt this earthquake out in Sacramento, but not nearly as strongly as it was felt here closer to the city of San Francisco, which is right where my mouse is now. So you can connect these almost with a straight line. In fact, there is a straight line that connects them, and it's what Alice Eastwood was standing over, and you now know probably that that is called the San Andreas Fault. So let's zoom in a little bit right here on this part of the San Andreas Fault, north of San Francisco. And when we look at this, we see some things like this fence that used to be connected. Of course, it was trying to keep some cows in, and now they can walk right through. And right along through here, that's where the fault goes. And as we are traveling along the fence from the left side of the picture, all of a sudden we have to make a jump off to the right to catch up with the fence again. And this is something that was very systematic. If you go more than 50 miles away down the coast, the same thing happens. As you start at one part of this fence and travel along, you have to jump over to the right to continue along to it. And then not too far from San Mateo in Crystal Springs, there's another fence. Same thing. It's moving along. You have to jump over to the right to catch up with it. And so they started noticing that there was a very systematic movement along these things that were straight. And we, of course, know that these straight things are called faults. So what exactly is a fault? Well, a fault is where two blocks of Earth's crust meet, and they're going to slide past one another. So on the surface, you see that fault as a straight line, but in fact, actually, the fault itself is the whole area where those two blocks are touching. So it's this red area in here down deep that at the surface is just a straight line. Now these blocks can move away from each other, like you're seeing in this picture here, and when they move away, they have to sort of open up a little bit of the underground surface, and you see some layers exposed that look like that. And in real life, you might see something like this where there's some layers. Here's one, and the front face of this layer along the fault is exposed, which tells us that this particular place was an area where these two blocks of the crust were moving away from each other. Similarly, you can crush blocks of crust together so they push over one another, and when that happens, you'll see things like this. So let's see if you can see this layer right here and pick it up on the other side. It goes up, and this person is pointing to the fault, which shows that this particular spot, these two blocks were being pushed towards each other, which is why this layer overrode the other one. Faults can also slide horizontally. That's where neither one is going up or down. There's no getting closer or further apart from one another. We're just looking at things sliding sideways past each other, and that can happen in either direction. In real life, you see this in this particular picture here of a farm field. If you were walking along one of these rows of crops, this side of the fault did not go up or down relative to the other one. It's basically still a big flat field. But when you get to the fault, you have to jump over to the left to get to the things on the other side. So this is, we think about it as the top part of this picture moving to the left. Or you can also think about it as the other way around, from the other perspective, that the bottom side of the picture moved the other direction. And in an earthquake, we aren't actually able to tell which block actually moved. All we know is that relative to one another, the one block moved one direction, and the other block moved the opposite direction. And they both might have moved, or maybe only one, but you really can't tell just looking at these offset features which was the culprit, if you will, which was the one that actually moved. This motion, this buildup of strain, and then the sudden release in an earthquake helps us define what an earthquake actually is. The shaking that you feel in an earthquake is the sudden release of energy that happens when those blocks suddenly slide past one another. So when we actually talk about an earthquake, we're talking about two things. We're talking about the seismic waves that are let out from that sudden release of energy, and we're talking about the sudden movement of those blocks sliding past one another. Now, faults can have earthquakes, whether they're coming closer together, further apart, or sliding side by side. All of those things involve the two blocks sliding past one another.